Hello and welcome to The Financial Dad, where I, your average young adult, ask my dad, your not so average financial advisor, all of my burning finance questions. And yes, this is my real dad. In this video, we're going to be discussing end-of-life planning, mainly wills and trusts. So, what is a will?
A will is a legal document that controls how you want things done after you pass away.
So what specific items would it control? What kind of things can you ask for?
Okay, there are some very specific things it controls and some very specific things it cannot control.
Okay.
First, under its control, any asset that you have in the world that is under your name only. So it says, Bill Johnson on it.
Yeah.
That is in your name only. The will can control that asset. Okay. It can also control any assets that have a beneficiary designation, like a life insurance policy or a retirement plan, where you have named your estate as being the beneficiary of that, and it will control the disposition of that as well. It can set up what you want done with personal effects or property. And finally, it typically will say who you would want to be the guardian of your children, typically if you happen to be the second of two parents passing away.
You mentioned an estate.
Yes.
What really is an estate?
An estate is essentially all of those assets in your name around the world, basically, and all of those debts that you have around the world. And then personal effects, the kinds of things that I mentioned before that you might want to designate someone to receive it. All of that is considered to be your total estate.
Okay.
You can add life insurance to that, and it's retirement plans and all those kinds of things are all included in it.
So, is there anything a will not cover?
There are several things that a will cannot cover or control. Let's call it control. Okay. Any asset that you have that is jointly titled with someone else.
So, like a married couple.
If you're married,
something.
and most houses, for example, are titled as joint tenancy by the entirety. When you pass away, that goes automatically to your spouse, no matter what your will says. If you have a joint checking account and it says joint tenants with rights of survivorship, or JTWROS, if you pass away, no matter what your will says, that will go to the other person that's named on that list. It doesn't control anything where there is a beneficiary designation.
Okay.
So a life insurance policy, if it's not named to the estate, if it's named to Aunt Sally and you wanted it to go to Uncle John, it doesn't matter. It's going to Aunt Sally if that's who the beneficiary is on it. Your retirement plans, IRA accounts, these all have what are called beneficiary designations on them as well. Whoever is named as the beneficiary, that's where that money goes. And I'll give you a quick story. I once worked with a client where it was a second marriage, and everything that the husband had was still beneficiaried to the first wife.
Oh.
Yes, and I made good friends with the second wife when I helped correct that error that hadn't been fixed after the divorce from the first marriage.
Yeah.
There's one other thing that a will does control that's jointly titled, which is tenants in common. If you have tenants in common, then the will say where that money goes or how that's disposed of.
Okay.
It's the only joint titling that does work that way.
Does a will include any funeral plans? Is that a place where you would
It
say
can be
that?
in the will. Sometimes people just write that up separately because you might have a favorite song that you like, and that might change, and you don't want to go all the way back through a legal process and amending the will to change the name of your favorite song for the funeral.
Okay. So now let's talk about a trust. How does that differ from a will?
Well, a will, a trust could be something that is created by a will. Trust is a legal entity that it may exist prior to the death of the person, or it may be created upon the death of the person. If it's upon the death of the person, it's called a testamentary trust because it's in the last will and testament. Okay? So, but a trust is a mechanism for handling things after someone has passed away.
So does it control different things than a will would?
Well, it controls them longer. The will is designed to get you through the process called probate, which is the process of basically distributing all the assets to where they're supposed to go. Once they've gone there, the will is sort of out of business, if you will. It's done. Okay? A trust can remain for the life of everybody that you know, plus 99 years, literally. So a trust is a longer term thing than the will. It's the permanent piece of it all. And a trust is typically used in situations where you want to provide for management and protection of the assets of the estate rather than turning it over to the people directly that are going to hold or are going to inherit the assets.
Yeah.
So that's typically why a trust is created and what it does.
Okay. What are some examples of like a typical setup of will and trust? Like,
okay, well, start with the simplest version, which is called the simple will. Okay, that's a good place to start.
Yeah, it's a good name.
A simple will, in essence, says I leave everything to my spouse, and in the event of my death, and that's that. Yeah. And usually the spouse has the exact opposite, saying I leave everything to my husband. Yeah. Just like that. That's called a simple will. That doesn't help a lot if you have children, or if the spouse really isn't in a position to manage money for some reason, whatever the reason might be. So the next type of a will is a simple will, possibly with a marital trust. That might be something where I leave everything to my spouse, but in trust.
So what does that actually practically mean then?
It means that you name a trustee. It could be a bank. It could be a financial person. It could be the wife. It could be the husband, depending upon who this is about. But so that person manages and takes care of the assets as the trustee, as a fiduciary, for the benefit of the person who is getting the assets, who is receiving the assets. So if it is the spouse, if it's the same as the spouse, then it's typically not so much about management as it is about some sort of protection. So for example, at the end of the spouse's life, those assets may or may not go where the wife wants them to go. For example, to a second husband. Those assets may go to the children, or those assets might go to the parents of the husband or first one who passed away, first spouse who died. So the trust is something that allows for money to be managed and protected during the life of the people or person for whom it's to benefit. And then after that, where it goes may be set up by the person who first died or by the persons who were beneficiaries of the trust.
Okay. I think I understand.
Okay.
It's a little complex. It sounds like the kind of thing you would need someone to help you kind of figure out what the best path for you is specifically.
Well, virtually everybody would use a lawyer for this service. Lawyers, I'm sure, can explain it more clearly than I can, because that's their profession, is to work with this and explain it. So there is one more type of will and trust arrangement that comes into play for younger people who get married and or just are having children. And that is a contingent trust. A contingent trust basically just means in the event that both spouses have passed away, what happens to all of our assets and how do we protect our children? So a contingent trust will often say, not just who's to be the guardians, et cetera, that'll be in the will part, but in the trust it might say something like, these assets are to be held in trust, here's who the trustees are, or here the trustee is. when a child reaches the age of 25, maybe a third of the trust would be distributed at that point to the child outright. So they get a chunk of money. When a child hits 30, maybe another chunk. And when a child hits 35 or 40, maybe the balance of the trust goes to the child outright.
Okay.
So it protects the child essentially from the child and or from whoever is around the child at that time who may be influencing the child when they're a little younger maybe than, is good to inherit big, large amounts of money. It's very, very common for trusts for children to be set up in a way that gives them money later on. Not
when they're a little more mature, handle
correct
their own finances
That's
a little
correct.
bit better.
That's correct.
Okay, I understand. So a trust is more so to control how things are almost pieced out and given after the person has passed away, not just right after.
Correct. For
over
a long
period of
time
time
after. Correct.
I see.
Correct. Yep.
Okay. Are there any other important documents that someone might want to have drafted if they're also looking into these?
Yeah, there are two more that probably would make sense for, again, younger people, especially if they're married and or have started to have children, okay? The first is what's called a power of attorney. A power of attorney allows another person to have the legal authority to act in your place. So things like paying bills, right? Or filing a tax return, or selling a house, or any number of things. A power of attorney gives someone else the power to do that in the event that you're either not around, or that you're too ill to do it, or you could be in a coma, whatever the issue is. There are two types of power of attorney. One is called a durable power of attorney, and that is in place at all times. So nothing has to happen for that to come into play. You don't have to be away. The person doesn't have to have become ill or anything like that. The other person can just act in their stead at any time. The second type is a springing power of attorney. A springing power of attorney springs into action in the event something happens. Okay. So if somebody's in the hospital, if somebody's away, out of the country, etc. So if an event happens, then the powers are there. But to use the power of attorney, then you would have to prove that that thing has happened before anybody would use it. Correct.
A little more difficult to use.
But that's the power of attorney, and it's very important in a time when people sometimes are in comas, are unable to act for themselves because of medical illness or brain injuries, or in the case of my family, Alzheimer's, for example. Okay. The second type of document is called a medical care directive or a healthcare proxy. It has different names. This is a document that says, hey, in the event that I am not able to make my own decisions about my own medical care, I designate this person to do it. Now, in most situations, if you are married, in most states, your spouse is automatically the person legally given that authority. It's one of the things that comes along with marriage. But if you are not married, and you know that there would be certain wishes you would have. For example, I don't want to be held in a vegetative state. I would want to be disconnected from life support under certain conditions, et cetera, et cetera. Whatever those things are, you've put it in writing, and that tells them, what you would want to do, so that there's no question later on, if you're not able to tell people what your wishes would be, someone has the authority. And whether it could be a sibling who's a doctor, it could be a close friend who knows your wishes, but that person could present this to the hospital and say, I know what the person wanted to have done in the event something went wrong, and that person has the authority to tell the hospital what to do. So those are all very important to have in place even for young people, in particular once you're married, and in particular once you have children. Having children. Very, very important stuff. Simple, but important.
Yeah. Well, no, it's extremely important, and I hope that this episode was able to simplify a topic that can be, pretty intimidating and not pleasant to think about. But I hope that this has made it a little bit easier to deal with when the time comes. Thanks so much for watching this video. If you have any questions for us, feel free to reach us at our website and make sure to click on to the next.